My name is Sarah Miller, and on the humid evening of my 55th birthday, while the golden sun set over the manicured hedges of our 3-acre estate in Lake Forest, Illinois, my husband of 28 years handed me a gift-wrapped box that contained no jewelry, no perfume, and no sentiment. Inside was a thick, legal-grade folder bound in heavy cardstock and a printed screenshot of an Uber voucher. He looked at me, his eyes as cold as the stainless steel of the $4,500 Rolex Submariner he was adjusting on his wrist, and spoke with a clinical detachment that shattered my world. "Here is your 55th birthday present, Sarah," he said, his voice echoing in the marble foyer of the home I had meticulously decorated and maintained for 3 decades. "It is a 14-page divorce settlement and a one-way Uber credit to a motel on the outskirts of town. My new wife moves in at 9 a.m. on Monday." I stood there, paralyzed, the smell of the expensive diptyque baize candle I had lit for our celebratory dinner suddenly cloying and suffocating. "My name is Sarah Miller. I am 55 years old, and for 28 years, I was the invisible engine behind Miller Global Logistics. While my husband Marcus took the titles and the accolades, I was the one who spent 10 hours a day in a windowless home office, managing the complex payroll for 400 employees, balancing the ledgers, and navigating the treacherous waters of international tax law for a multi-million-dollar firm, all for the salary of $0 and 0 cents, because I believed we were building a legacy together. I was discarded like a broken office chair, a piece of outdated equipment no longer required for the firm's next stage of growth. But I am getting ahead of myself. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of the end, to the cold reality of a life built on the shifting sands of a man's vanity and the absolute, crushing weight of a betrayal that costs more than any bank account can hold. The evening began with a deceptive normalcy that I now realize was carefully orchestrated cruelty. I had spent the afternoon at the local Whole Foods market on Waukegan Road, purchasing $350 worth of prime ingredients for a birthday meal Marcus had insisted we share alone. I remember the exact weight of the organic ribeye steaks in my hand and the way the condensation felt on the bottle of 2018 Opus 1 Cabernet Sauvignon, a wine that retails for nearly $400, which I had carefully selected because it was his favorite. I wore a navy blue silk dress from Eileen Fisher, a brand I chose because it was elegant but understated, much like the role I had played in Marcus's life. I spent an hour in front of the vanity mirror, applying my makeup with a precision that attempted to hide the fine lines of a woman who had worried through 2 recessions and 3 major corporate audits to keep her husband's dream afloat. As I smoothed the wrinkles of my dress, I heard the heavy, rhythmic thrum of his 2024 midnight black Mercedes-Benz S-Class pulling into the cobblestone driveway. The sound of the engine, a precision-engineered hum, usually brought me a sense of security. But that evening, it felt like the tolling of a bell. Marcus entered the house at exactly 6:30 p.m., the scent of Tom Ford's Oud Wood trailing behind him, a fragrance that costs $295 for a small bottle and smells of power and indifference. He didn't kiss me. He didn't even look at the table I had set with our finest Wedgwood bone china and the heavy silver cutlery we had received as a wedding gift in 1996. Instead, he walked straight to the mahogany sideboard, poured himself a finger of Macallan 18-year-old scotch, and adjusted the cuff of his bespoke Italian suit. The silence in the room was thick, heavy with the humidity of the Illinois summer and the unspoken words of a man who had already moved on. When he finally spoke, he didn't wish me a happy birthday. He simply reached into his briefcase, a $2,200 Toomey leather attaché, and pulled out the box. The documents inside were printed on high-quality 24-pound bond paper, the kind of paper that feels substantial and permanent. I stared at the first page, my eyes blurring as I saw the words "Petition for Dissolution of Marriage" and "Petitioner, Marcus A. Miller." My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked at the 14-page settlement, noticing the meticulous detail with which he had stripped me of everything. The house, the cars, the accounts we had built. They were all tied to the corporation, a corporation I had helped build but never officially owned a share of. He had used the very tax loopholes I had researched for him to ensure I was legally nothing more than a ghost in his financial empire. The Uber credit he mentioned was for a budget motel in Waukegan, a place where the rooms smell of stale cigarettes and the nightly rate is $65, a far cry from our $4.2 million estate with its heated floors and custom-built library. I felt the blood drain from my face, my hands shaking so violently that the papers rustled like dry leaves in a storm. I looked up at him, searching for a glimmer of the man I had supported through every late-night crisis, the man whose brow I had wiped when he was sick, the man whose children I had raised while he traveled the world for business meetings that I now realize were auditions for my replacement. He stood there, buffing the crystal of his Rolex with the edge of his silk pocket square, his expression one of mild boredom. He told me that his new wife, a 26-year-old former intern named Tiffany, who had joined the logistics firm 6 months ago, would be moving in on Monday morning at 9 a.m. sharp. He instructed me to have my personal belongings packed and moved by then, noting that anything left behind would be hauled away by a junk removal service he had already scheduled for $800. The sheer clinical efficiency of his betrayal was more painful than a physical blow. He had calculated the cost of my disposal with the same cold precision I had used to calculate the firm's quarterly dividends. He mentioned that the settlement included a one-time severance payment of $50,000, a sum that wouldn't even cover a year's property taxes on the house we were standing in. It was a pittance, a tip left for a waitress after a long shift, a final insult to 28 years of labor and loyalty. As I stood in the foyer, the cool air from the central cooling system, which I had just had serviced for $1,200 last month, blew across my skin, giving me chills. I realized that to Marcus, I was never a partner. I was a service provider who had reached the end of her contract. I thought back to the countless nights I spent hunched over a 27-inch IMAX screen, my eyes straining as I reconciled spreadsheets and tracked shipping containers from Shanghai to Savannah. I remembered the 2008 financial crisis when I stayed awake for 48 hours straight, moving assets and renegotiating contracts with vendors to ensure that Marcus wouldn't lose the firm. I saved us then. I saved his reputation, his credit score, and his pride. And my reward was a 14-page document and a ride to a motel. The contrast between the life I had curated and the future he was forcing me into was a chasm of pure, unadulterated injustice. The golden boy husband, the pillars of the community, the Millers of Lake Forest. It was all a facade that he was now tearing down because he had found a newer, shinier model to display in his foyer. The technicalities of the settlement were a masterclass in corporate greed. He had moved the majority of our liquid assets into offshore accounts and trust funds that were shielded from the divorce proceedings, a tactic he had once joked about after a meeting with his $500 an hour attorneys. I hadn't realized then that the shield was being built against me. My name was on the utility bills, which I paid every month. The $450 electric bill, the $180 water bill, the $300 landscaping fee, but my name was absent from the deeds and the titles that mattered. I was the person who kept the engine running, but I didn't own the car. As I stood there, clutching the settlement papers, I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. The pain was still there, a jagged edge cutting through my chest, but beneath it was a rising tide of realization. I knew where every cent was hidden. I knew the passwords to the encrypted servers because I was the one who had set up the security protocols. I knew the true value of the logistics firm wasn't in the trucks or the warehouses, but in the proprietary routing software I had helped develop during the pandemic. Marcus thought he was discarding a broken office chair, but he had forgotten that I was the one who held the keys to the entire building. He walked toward the kitchen, his leather loafers clicking on the French limestone tiles, and told me he was going to bed. He said he expected the house to be presentable for Tiffany's arrival. He didn't even have the decency to stay and watch the wreckage of my life settle. I stood in the foyer for a long time, the silence of the house pressing in on me. Outside, a light rain began to fall, the drops tapping against the high-performance Pella windows I had installed last year to improve the home's energy efficiency. I looked at the Uber voucher again. A one-way trip to a motel. He wanted me gone, erased, and forgotten by Monday morning. But family isn't blood, and it certainly isn't a legal contract signed under the duress of a midlife crisis. Family is the person who stays when the truth comes out, and Marcus had proven that he was never truly my family. He was a business partner who had attempted a hostile takeover of my dignity. As I turned toward my home office, not to pack, but to sit at the desk where I had spent the better part of my life, I realized that the $50,000 he offered wasn't a settlement. It was a down payment on the storm I was about to unleash. He had spent years underestimating the woman who balanced his books, never realizing that the person who knows where the money goes is the most powerful person in the room. The transition from the discarded wife to the architect of his downfall began with a single, steady breath. I was 55, I was homeless as of Monday, and I had never felt more dangerous. The truth was about to be unpacked, and Marcus Miller was about to find out that a broken office chair can still trip you up when you're running for the door. Зрозумів, вибач за цей збій. Більше ніяких представлень, нових імен чи повторів «мене звати». Я продовжую ту саму історію Сари Міллер із Лейк-Форест, або Скоттсдейла, як у другому варіанті, яку ми почали. Ми зупинилися на тому, що я сиджу в кабінеті, дивлюся на документи про розлучення і починаю діяти, маючи всі паролі та знання про фінанси. Ось пряме продовження без жодних вступів. The silence of the house was punctuated only by the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a $12,000 mahogany heirloom that Julian had insisted on buying to impress the partners, but it felt like a countdown to my own execution. I sat in the dim glow of my dual-monitor setup, the screens casting a cold blue light over the 14 pages of the settlement that lay scattered like shrapnel across my desk. My fingers, still trembling slightly from the shock of his words, hovered over the mechanical keyboard, a high-end DAS keyboard I'd purchased myself to handle the thousands of lines of data I processed every month. Julian thought he had erased me with a signature and a $65 Uber credit, but he had made a fatal, arrogant assumption. He believed that because he owned the title of the company, he owned the knowledge within it. He was a man who navigated life by looking at the GPS, never realizing that I was the one who had mapped every road, identified every dead end, and hard-coded the very infrastructure he relied on to find his way home. I logged into the mainframe of Miller Logistics, the familiar hum of the server in the basement vibrating through the floorboards of my office. This system wasn't just a database. It was a digital diary of 28 years of my life, a meticulous record of every dollar earned and every cent hidden. My first task was to verify the exact location of the marketing fees I had flagged earlier, those $30,000 monthly transfers that had always seemed just a bit too clean, just a bit too frequent. I navigated through the encrypted subfolders, bypassing the layers of security I had built to keep the IRS at bay, until I reached the core transaction logs. There it was. A shell company registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Azure Sky Holdings. Julian thought he was clever, using a name that sounded like a legitimate aviation consultancy, but the wire transfer details told a different story. The funds were being redirected to a private concierge service in Paris, paying for a $12,000 a night suite at the Hotel Plaza Athénée and a series of high-end jewelry purchases from Van Cleef and Arpels that I had certainly never seen. The betrayal had a specific financial signature, a trail of breadcrumbs left by a man who was too lazy to cover his tracks because he assumed no one would ever look. As I scrolled through the records, my eyes burning in the 3:15 a.m. darkness, I found the documentation for the 2024 Midnight Black Mercedes-Benz S-Class. He had leased it through a corporate subsidiary to avoid personal asset declaration, a move that saved him $1,500 a month in taxes, but left a glaring paper trail in the company's liabilities. I pulled up the fleet management software and saw the GPS logs for the vehicle. It hadn't just been to business meetings in Phoenix. It had spent 3 weekends a month at a luxury beachfront condo in La Jolla, California, a property that wasn't on our personal asset list, nor was it on the company's official real estate portfolio. I felt a surge of cold, calculating adrenaline. He had spent years building a secret life on the back of my unpaid labor, using the tax errors I corrected to fund a lifestyle for a woman who probably didn't even know how to spell logistics. I pulled up the bank accounts, the real ones, not the sanitized versions he showed the divorce lawyers. The main operating account for Miller Logistics held a balance of $2.4 million, but it was the secondary reserve account that caught my attention. It was a stagnant pool of $4.8 million that Julian had earmarked for future expansion, a fund I had managed with a 4.2% annual yield through conservative bond investments. According to the divorce settlement, this account was listed as restricted corporate capital, making it untouchable in a personal split. But I knew the truth. I had drafted the operating agreement for that fund myself in 2012, and buried in paragraph 14B was a clause that defined restricted as contingent upon the active participation of the chief financial officer, a role that was technically mine on paper, even if Julian never gave me the title or the salary. By attempting to fire me and replace me with Tiffany, he was inadvertently triggering a dissolution clause that would freeze those assets and subject them to a full forensic audit. I took a sip of cold coffee, the bitterness matching the taste in my mouth, and began the process of unpacking the truth. I started by creating an encrypted backup of the last 5 years of tax returns, the ones where I had saved him from $140,000 in penalties. I moved the files to a secure off-site cloud server that Julian didn't even know existed. Then I accessed the payroll system. I looked at the entry for Tiffany, the new wife who was supposed to take over on Monday. She was currently on the books as a senior strategic consultant with a salary of $165,000 a year plus a $20,000 signing bonus. I looked at her credentials. A 2-year degree from a community college, and 3 months of experience at a retail boutique. She wasn't a consultant, she was a liability. I began to draft a series of anonymous compliance alerts to our major shipping partners, companies like Maersk and FedEx, informing them of a potential internal restructuring that could impact their contractual service level agreements. Without me to manage the delicate balance of their schedules, the entire logistics chain would fall apart within 72 hours. The room felt smaller now, the walls of the mansion closing in as I realized that every piece of furniture, every $500 silk curtain, and every expensive rug was bought with the blood of my silence. I thought about my 2014 Honda CR-V sitting in the driveway, its 142,000 miles a testament to my frugality and his greed. I thought about the $800 shoes he wore while I bought my clothes at Target. The contrast wasn't just unfair, it was a crime of the heart and the pocketbook. I wasn't just losing a husband, I was reclaiming a life that had been stolen from me in $30 increments over nearly 3 decades. As the clock struck 4 a.m., I began to draft my own version of a birthday gift. It wasn't 14 pages of legal jargon. It was a single 3-page letter addressed to the regional director of the IRS, detailing the irregularities in the Azure Sky Holdings accounts, backed by 300 pages of supporting evidence I had spent the last 4 hours compiling. I looked out the window at the Scottsdale skyline, the lights of the city flickering in the distance. Julian was likely asleep in our $15,000 Hastings mattress, dreaming of his new life with Tiffany, unaware that the foundation of his empire was being dismantled by a woman in a $15 Target nightgown. He had treated me like a ghost for 28 years, and now I was going to haunt him with the very numbers he thought were beneath him. I checked the Uber credit one last time. It was still active. I decided I wouldn't be using it to go to a motel on the outskirts of town. I would be using it to go to the office of the most aggressive forensic accountant in the state of Arizona, a woman I had secretly consulted 3 months ago when I first suspected Julian was moving money. She had told me then that I needed the smoking gun. Tonight, I had found an entire armory. My hands were no longer shaking. The fear that had paralyzed me at dinner had been replaced by a cold, surgical precision. I began to pack a small bag, but I didn't take much. I took my birth certificate, my passport, and the original handwritten journals I had kept since 1996, journals that documented every time Julian told me to fix a number or hide a payment. These weren't just memories. They were contemporaneous records of corporate fraud. I looked at the Wedgwood china on the table, still set for a dinner that never happened, and felt no regret. The house was a museum of a dead marriage, and I was finally ready to stop being the curator. As the first hint of gray light began to touch the desert horizon, I sent a final email from my secure account. It was a kill switch command for the proprietary routing software I had developed. It didn't delete the code, but it locked the administrative access, requiring a 24-character encryption key that only I possessed. On Monday morning at 9 a.m., when Tiffany tried to log in to manage the firm's national fleet, she would find a blank screen and a system-wide lockout. Julian would have his new wife and his $110,000 Mercedes, but he would have no company to pay for them. The logistics of his downfall were now in motion, and there was no way to reroute the inevitable. I stood in the foyer, the same place where he had handed me the divorce papers just a few hours ago. The air was cool, the scent of the desert rain finally reaching the house. I realized that for the first time in 28 years, I wasn't worried about the budget, the taxes, or the payroll. I was only worried about the time. It was 5:30 a.m. In 3.5 hours, the first bank would open. In 4 hours, my lawyer would be served with the real evidence. And in 48 hours, the man who tried to discard me like a broken chair would realize that I was the only thing holding the entire house of cards together. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, but Julian had left long ago. And now, it was my turn to walk away and let the truth do the talking. I opened the front door, the heavy oak swinging wide to reveal the wide, open expanse of the Arizona morning. My name is Sarah Miller. I am 55 years old, and I am finally, officially, off the clock. The absolute soul-crushing betrayal crystallized on August 14th at precisely 7:22 p.m., a moment etched into my memory with the surgical precision of a diamond-tipped blade cutting through glass. We were standing on our expansive rear veranda in Scottsdale, an architectural marvel of limestone and wrought iron that overlooked the valley, where the air was thick with the suffocatingly sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine from the $12,000 professional landscaping project I had supervised just the previous spring. The desert heat was finally beginning to break, replaced by a deceptive evening breeze that rustled the leaves of the imported olive trees, and for a fleeting, foolish second, I actually thought Julian was about to apologize for his distance over the last few months. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his $1,200 Brunello Cucinelli linen blazer and handed me a heavy manila envelope, the kind of utilitarian stationery that looked grotesque against the backdrop of our luxury outdoor furniture. My heart, still clinging to some dying ember of hope, whispered that perhaps inside was a pair of first-class tickets for a celebratory Mediterranean cruise, or a deed to the vacation cottage in Sedona I had mentioned wanting for years. But as I pulled back the metal clasp with fingers that had spent the day reconciling a $200,000 shipping discrepancy for his firm, I realized there was no travel itinerary, only the cold, stark letterhead of a high-stakes family law firm specializing in asset protection and aggressive dissolution. The physical weight of the legal filing in my hand was nothing compared to the emotional weight of what happened next, as the French doors to the master suite creaked open and my best friend of 15 years, Elena, stepped out into the twilight. She didn't just walk out. She performed an entrance draped in my $1,200 hand-painted silk robe from La Perla, a garment I had saved for special occasions and which now looked like a trophy of her conquest as it shimmered under the recessed LED veranda lighting. She didn't have the decency to look me in the eye or offer a shred of performative remorse for the decade and a half of secrets we had shared, the late-night phone calls, and the way I had held her hand through her own messy divorce 3 years prior. Instead, she stood there with a practiced, predatory elegance, holding a crystal glass filled with the 2019 Camus Special Selection Cabernet Sauvignon that retails for $85 a bottle, the very wine I had stocked in our cellar for our upcoming anniversary. She took a slow, deliberate sip, her lips leaving a smudge of crimson lipstick on the rim of the glass that I had hand-washed 1,000 times to prevent water spots. And then she let out a small, sharp smirk that felt like a physical slap across my face. Julian stood beside her, his posture rigid and his expression devoid of any human warmth, looking every bit the cold-blooded executive I had helped him become through 28 years of unpaid labor and strategic genius. He didn't offer an explanation for why my best friend was wearing my clothes and drinking my wine. He simply checked the time on his $4,500 Rolex Submariner as if this entire orchestrated nightmare was just another line item on his busy Saturday schedule. I felt the ground beneath my feet, the expensive Italian tiles that I had picked out to match the desert sunset, turn into a void as the reality of my situation began to pour out of the legal documents in my shaking hands. While I had been sitting in the home office at 2:45 a.m., fixing his $140,000 tax errors and ensuring the company's survival during the last audit, Julian had been systematically dismantling our shared life with the help of the woman I called my sister. He had already executed the final phase of his plan hours before the sun went down, draining our joint savings and investment accounts of exactly $412,650, every cent of the liquidity I had meticulously managed and saved for our retirement. That money, which represented decades of my frugality and the $30 Target outfits I wore while he bought $800 shoes, had vanished into a complex offshore entity registered in the British Virgin Islands, a ghost corporation I had inadvertently helped him structure when he told me we needed asset protection against potential frivolous lawsuits. I looked at the digital banking app on my phone, my breath hitching in my throat as I saw the balance of our primary checking account. It read exactly $14.12, a number so small and insulting it felt like a final, calculated joke from a man who knew exactly how much it cost to buy a single meal at a fast food drive-thru. I was standing in a $5 million mansion that was technically owned by a corporate trust I no longer had access to, facing a husband who had replaced me and a best friend who had stolen my identity, left with nothing but the clothes on my back and a single battered Samsonite suitcase he had already packed for me and left by the door. Inside that suitcase, which sat like a tombstone on the limestone floor, were not my nice dresses or the jewelry I had inherited from my grandmother, but a collection of my oldest, most worn-out sweaters and a few pairs of faded jeans from my college days. He had curated my exit with the same cruelty he used to manage his logistics fleet, ensuring that I left with the absolute minimum required to keep me from freezing while he kept the silk, the wine, and the millions of dollars in equity I had earned with my own sweat. Elena took another sip of the Cabernet, her eyes finally meeting mine with a look of triumphant pity that made my blood run cold, and she whispered something to Julian about how the atmosphere had turned sour, before turning her back on me to walk back into the house I had spent 30 years making a home. The sound of her silk robe whispering against the floorboards was the final note in the symphony of my destruction, a sound that echoed in the vast, empty space where my life used to be. I looked at Julian, the man whose $110,000 Mercedes I had polished, whose reputation I had saved, and whose children I had raised, and I realized that he didn't see a human being in front of him. He saw a depreciated asset that had finally been written off the books. He told me, with a voice as flat as a ledger sheet, that my one-way Uber credit to the motel on the outskirts of town was already active and that the driver would be at the gate in precisely 6 minutes. He advised me not to make a scene, reminding me that the security cameras were recording and that any erratic behavior would be used to justify a restraining order that would complicate the $50,000 pittance of a settlement he was offering. The injustice of it was a physical weight in my lungs, a crushing pressure that made every breath feel like I was inhaling broken glass, as I realized that the $412,650 he had stolen was the very money I had saved by not taking vacations, by not buying new cars, and by doing the work of 3 executive assistants for free. I walked toward the front door, my legs feeling like they belonged to a stranger, and past the hallway mirror where I caught a glimpse of myself. A 55-year-old woman in a faded Target blouse, clutching a manila envelope of lies and a suitcase of rags, standing in a house that smelled of jasmine and betrayal. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold metal of my keys, which I knew would no longer work by Monday morning, and the crumpled receipt for the $350 birthday dinner I had bought for him just days ago. I had exactly $14.12 to my name, a sum that wouldn't even cover the cost of the wine Elena was currently drinking in my kitchen. And yet, as I stepped out onto the cobblestone driveway and heard the hum of the approaching Uber, a different kind of sensation began to stir beneath the grief. It was the feeling of a predator realizing that their prey was far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. A flicker of the same clinical, mathematical brilliance that had built Miller Logistics from nothing. Julian and Elena thought they had won because they held the gold and the keys, but they had forgotten that I held the blueprints. They had forgotten that every dollar that vanished into that offshore entity had a digital fingerprint that I had coded, and every tax error Julian made was a landmine I had opted not to detonate. Until now. As I climbed into the back of the modest Toyota Camry that served as my one-way credit to Exile, I didn't look back at the mansion or the shimmering infinity pool. I looked at the manila envelope in my lap and thought about the $412,650 not as a loss, but as the price Julian was paying for the most expensive mistake of his life. The motel on the outskirts of town would be damp. It would smell of industrial cleaner and regret, and it would be the place where I would spend the next 48 hours dismantling everything Julian Miller thought he owned. He had left me with $14.12 and a suitcase of old sweaters, but he had also left me with the one thing he could never replace, the absolute, total knowledge of where every single body was buried in his financial empire. Family isn't the people who share your bed or your bank account. Family is the people who don't drain your life's work while you're sleeping. And as the gates of the estate clicked shut behind me, I knew that the man I had loved for 28 years was now nothing more than a target in a high-stakes audit that was about to begin. The betrayal of August 14th wasn't the end of my story. It was the opening statement in a trial he wasn't prepared to lose, and as I watched the Scottsdale lights fade in the rearview mirror, I realized that for the first time in my life, I wasn't balancing the books for him. I was finally, ruthlessly, balancing them for myself. The door to room 214 of the Sunset Vista Motel clicked shut with a hollow, metallic sound that echoed the emptiness in my chest, leaving me standing in a space that cost exactly $65 a night and smelled of industrial-grade bleach and decades of stale cigarette smoke. The air conditioning unit beneath the single, grimy window didn't just blow cold air. It hummed at a jagged, high-pitched frequency that seemed to vibrate through the very marrow of my bones and made my teeth ache with every shudder of its overworked compressor. I dropped my single suitcase of old sweaters onto the thin polyester bedspread that featured a faded floral pattern from a bygone era and looked around the room, realizing that this 400-square-foot box was now the entirety of my world, while Julian and Elena were likely clinking glasses in my $5 million kitchen. I didn't let myself collapse onto the bed, nor did I let the tears that had been threatening to spill since 7:22 p.m. finally fall, because I knew with a sudden, freezing clarity that grief was a luxury I could no longer afford on a budget of $14.12. Instead, I pulled out the wobbly, laminate-topped desk from the wall, ignored the sticky residue left by a previous occupant's coffee cup, and reached into my bag for the one thing that had always been my weapon of choice, a clean, yellow legal pad and a black Uniball Onyx pen. I sat there in the flickering light of a single overhead bulb that hummed in sympathy with the air conditioner, and I drew a sharp, vertical line down the center of the first page, creating a ledger of my own survival. On the left side, I wrote the heading "What They Took," in a hand that was finally starting to steady itself as the shock wore off and the analytical part of my brain took the wheel. Under that column, I listed the 28 years of my life I had given to a man who viewed me as a disposable asset, the $412,650 that had vanished from our joint account into the ether of a Caribbean tax haven, and the dignity of a woman who had been replaced by her best friend in her own silk robe. I listed the 5,200 square foot mansion, the 2024 Mercedes-Benz S-Class, the Wedgwood china, and the very air I breathed in Lake Forest, all of which had been systematically stripped from me by a man who thought he was a genius simply because he had the audacity to be cruel. It was a long, painful list of subtractions that should have left me feeling like a zero, a void in the shape of a wife. But as the clock on the bedside table blinked 3 a.m. in a harsh red glow, I moved my pen to the right side of the paper. The heading on the right side was written in larger, bolder letters, "What they forgot, I know." As I began to write, the hum of the motel room seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the familiar, comforting rhythm of data and logic that had been my true companion for 3 decades. Julian and Elena had spent months, perhaps years, planning this coup, but they had made the arrogant, fatal mistake of underestimating the clerk who sat in the home office while they played at being titans of industry. They forgot that while Julian was the face of Miller Logistics, I was the nervous system, and I had built the proprietary routing software from the ground up, writing the original lines of Python code that managed the movement of 600 trucks across 48 states. They forgot that I didn't just have the admin passwords. I had the backdoor encryption keys I'd created as a failsafe during the 2021 server migration, keys that were hard-coded into the kernel and couldn't be changed by a simple password reset from a front-end user like Tiffany. By 4:12 a.m., the list on the right side of the page was twice as long as the list on the left, and a predatory heat was beginning to replace the cold chill in my blood. They forgot that I had spent the last 3 years maintaining a set of shadow ledgers, not because I was planning to betray Julian, but because I was terrified of his incompetence and needed a true record of our liabilities in case the IRS ever came knocking. Those ledgers, which I had backed up to a secure, cold storage drive now sitting in the pocket of my old sweater, contained the 2021 to 2023 records of every consulting fee paid to offshore entities and every equipment lease that was actually a payment for a luxury condo in La Jolla. I realized in that moment, as the first hint of a bruised purple dawn began to touch the edges of the motel curtains, that tears don't pay bills, they don't buy back your life, and they certainly don't provide justice, but data does all of those things and more. I wasn't going to spend my 55th year crying into a stained motel pillow. I was going to perform the most ruthless, comprehensive audit in the history of Illinois corporate law. I began to map out the technical vulnerabilities of Miller Logistics with the same precision I used to balance the quarterly taxes, noting that the entire fleet's fuel card system was tied to a master account that required a bi-monthly reconciliation, which only I knew how to perform without triggering a fraud alert at the bank. I wrote down the names of the 3 major vendors who had only stayed with the firm because of the personal relationships I had cultivated with their accounts payable departments. Women like me who knew what it was like to be the silent engine of a loud man's success. If I sent a single carefully worded email from my private server, those vendors would pull their credit lines within 24 hours, effectively grounding Julian's entire operation before he even had time to pour Elena her second glass of morning mimosa. The $14.12 in my pocket felt less like a pittance and more like the seed money for a revolution, as I realized that Julian had handed me a divorce settlement but had left me the blueprints to his entire empire. The hyper-realistic details of my revenge began to take shape on the yellow paper, punctuated by the scratching of my pen and the occasional groan of the motel's plumbing. I knew that at 9 a.m. on Monday, when Tiffany walked into my office, the office I had cleaned and vacated under duress, she would find a computer that looked perfectly functional, but was essentially a paperweight. I had already initiated a slow-drip data corruption script that would begin to scramble the destination coordinates for every long-haul shipment in the system. A subtle, invisible rot that wouldn't be noticed until the trucks were 500 miles in the wrong direction. Julian thought he was replacing a broken office chair, but he was actually removing the only person who knew how to keep the roof from caving in on his head. I spent the remaining hours of the night cross-referencing the shadow ledgers with the legal filing Julian had given me, finding no less than 12 instances of perjury in his declared assets. He had claimed the firm was worth $12 million with a net liquidity of $2.4 million, conveniently forgetting the $4.8 million reserve fund I had hidden in the bond market to protect us from inflation. By claiming that fund didn't exist in a sworn legal document, he hadn't just cheated me, he had committed a felony that would catch the eye of the state prosecutor's office the moment I handed over the evidence. My mind raced through the financial implications of his greed, calculating the exact moment his cash flow would hit zero once the freeze orders were in place. I wasn't just Sarah Miller, the discarded wife. I was Sarah Miller, the forensic nightmare that was about to walk into his polished, high-gloss life and tear it down brick by digital brick. The motel room, with its sagging mattress and its $65 a night price tag, no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a command center, a place of monastic focus where I could finally work without the distraction of Julian's vanity or the suffocating scent of Elena's perfume. I looked at my reflection in the spotted mirror above the vanity, seeing a woman who looked tired, yes, but also a woman who looked like she had just found the missing variable in a complex equation. I had lived in a 5,200-square-foot mansion and felt like a servant, but in this cramped, noisy room, I felt like a queen preparing for war. Every technical specification of the routing software, every hidden account number, and every fraudulent tax entry was a soldier in my army. And unlike the people in my life, these numbers were loyal and they were true. As the sun finally rose, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the outskirts of town, I folded the yellow legal pad and tucked it into my bag, next to the $14.12 and the suitcase of old sweaters. I knew exactly where I was going first. Not to a lawyer who would charge me $500 an hour to file paperwork that would take years to process, but to a small, independent tech firm owned by a man whose career Julian had tried to ruin a decade ago. I had the data, I had the keys, and I had the absolute, unwavering resolve of a woman who had been underestimated for the last time. The audit of Julian Miller was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability, and by the time the clock struck 9 a.m. on Monday morning, the man who tried to give me a one-way ticket to nowhere was going to find out exactly what happens when the engine finally decides to stop running for the hood ornament. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, but data is what stays when the family leaves, and I was going to make sure the truth was the loudest thing Julian Miller ever heard. The morning after my exile began, I stood in front of a heavy oak door in a professional building on South Wacker Drive in Chicago, clutching a weathered envelope containing my last $5,000, a secret, sacred stash my grandmother had tucked into a hollowed-out book before she passed, telling me to keep it for a day when the world turned cold. I walked into the office of Marcus Thorne, a high-end forensic accountant whose reputation was whispered in the corridors of the Dirksen Federal Building as the man who could find a single missing cent in a desert of a billion-day transaction log. The office smelled of expensive, freshly ground espresso from a Jura Z10 machine and the comforting, dry scent of old, high-rag content paper, a stark contrast to the chemical stench of the $65 motel room where I had spent the night mapping out my husband's destruction. Marcus didn't look like a bean counter. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal a vintage Omega Seamaster, and we sat in ergonomically perfect Herman Miller Aeron chairs that felt like the first piece of solid ground I had touched in 28 years. I laid my yellow legal pad and the encrypted thumb drive containing the 2021 to 2023 shadow ledgers on his glass-topped desk, my heart hammering against my ribs as I waited for him to verify that I wasn't just a woman scorned, but a woman with a legitimate lethal claim. He spent 4 hours in near total silence, his eyes darting across the dual-monitor setup as he cross-referenced my handwritten notes with the digital metadata I had harvested from the Miller Logistics mainframe before I was locked out. He didn't offer platitudes or comfort. He simply worked with a surgical, mathematical intensity that made me realize I had found the only person in the world who could speak my language of numbers and logic. Finally, he leaned back, the leather of the Aeron chair creaking slightly, and looked at me with an expression that was part admiration and part sheer professional awe. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and steady, "you don't just have a divorce case or a simple claim for back wages. You have a nuclear bomb that is currently ticking in the middle of Julian's living room." He pointed to a specific line in my shadow ledger where Julian had used a $45,000 corporate draw to pay for a kitchen remodel at the mansion, a remodel I now knew was being enjoyed by Elena, and he explained how that single transaction, when mapped against the fraudulent tax filings I had documented, converted a civil dispute into a federal racketeering investigation. To execute the plan, we spent the next 14 grueling months building a shell entity and a competitive strategy we codenamed Apex Solutions, a ghost firm designed to mirror and eventually devour the market share Julian thought he owned. I moved out of the motel and into a 400-square-foot studio apartment in a nondescript brick building in Rogers Park, a space so small that my bed, my desk, and my kitchenette existed in a single, cramped room where the radiator hissed like a wounded animal every time the Chicago wind whipped off the lake. While Julian and Elena were busy spending $45,000 of company funds on custom Carrara marble countertops and a sub-zero refrigerator that cost more than my annual rent, I was living on $3.50 bowls of instant shin black ramen and generic store-brand coffee that tasted like burnt beans and desperation. I sat at a second-hand IKEA desk I bought for $20 on Craigslist, surrounded by stacks of banking regulations and shipping manifests, working 12-hour shifts to build the infrastructure for Apex Solutions while the rest of the world slept. The contrast between my reality and the life I had left behind was a constant, sharpening whetstone for my resolve, a reminder of the injustice that fueled every line of code I wrote and every financial projection I calculated. I watched from a distance, through the digital windows of social media and industry trade journals, as Julian bragged about his visionary leadership and the expansion of Miller Logistics, while Elena posted photos of their $12,000 Italian leather sofa and the $800 shoes Julian continued to buy like they were candy. They were living high on the fumes of a dying engine, completely unaware that the woman they had discarded was systematically rerouting their oxygen. I kept a ledger of every cent they wasted from the corporate accounts, the $1,500 dinners at a Linnea, the $3,200 weekend trips to the Ritz-Carlton in Naples, and the $8,000 monthly payments for the midnight black Mercedes-Benz that Julian treated better than he ever treated me. Every time I felt my stomach growl or my fingers cramp from the cold in my poorly insulated studio, I would simply open the file for Apex Solutions and add another layer of technical redundancy to the trap I was setting. Marcus and I met every Tuesday night at a dim diner near his office, where he would review the progress of our forensic harvest, and I would provide the technical keys needed to unlock the next layer of Julian's offshore labyrinth. He was impressed by the proprietary routing software I had updated from my studio, a version of the code that was 10 times more efficient than the one Julian was currently using, the one I had silently sabotaged with the slow-drip data corruption script. We were building a company that didn't need 5,200-square-foot mansions or $110,000 cars to function. We were building a lean digital predator that would offer Julian's clients a 20% reduction in shipping costs by simply removing the vanity tax he applied to every contract. I realized that while Julian was playing the role of a titan, I was becoming the architect of his obsolescence, turning my 14-month exile into a masterclass in corporate warfare. Living in that 400-square-foot studio was a form of penance and preparation, a stripping away of the comforts that had blinded me to the reality of my marriage for 28 years. I learned the exact cost of a gallon of milk at the corner bodega, the price of a bus pass, and the precise amount of generic laundry detergent needed to wash my few remaining Target blouses in the communal basement machines. I was no longer the invisible engine behind a loud man. I was the sole proprietor of my own destiny, and for the first time in my life, the numbers I was balancing weren't a lie designed to protect Julian's ego. They were a countdown to the moment the nuclear bomb Marcus had identified would finally be detonated, a moment that would happen not in a courtroom with a judge, but in the marketplace where Julian's arrogance would be his final, unrecoverable debt. The technical specifications of Apex Solutions were a work of art, a seamless integration of cloud-based logistics and automated brokerage that I developed while sitting on a $15 folding chair. I knew every vulnerability in the Miller Logistics network because I had built it, and I knew exactly which major clients were dissatisfied with the increasing delays and administrative errors caused by Julian's neglect and Tiffany's sheer incompetence. My forensic accountant, Marcus, found the trail of the $412,650 that had vanished into the Cayman Islands, discovering that Julian had used a portion of it to pay off the mortgage on Elena's private condo in La Jolla, a direct violation of the fiduciary duty he owed to the corporation and to me as a de facto partner. We documented every misappropriated dollar, every fraudulent expense report, and every technical failure, building a dossier that was now over 800 pages long and backed by terabytes of digital evidence. As the 14th month approached, the air in Chicago turned crisp and biting, the first snow of the season dusting the window of my studio. I looked at the yellow legal pad I had kept since that first night in the motel, the pages now filled with a narrative of reclamation and revenge that was almost complete. I had spent $5,000 of my grandmother's legacy to buy a forensic accountant's brilliance, but I had spent 14 months of my life buying back my own soul. The ramen and the generic coffee no longer tasted like poverty. They tasted like the fuel of a long-distance runner who was finally within sight of the finish line. I had survived the motel, the $65 a night exile, and the crushing weight of betrayal by turning myself into a forensic nightmare that Julian could never have imagined during our 28 years of marriage. Family is who stays when the truth comes out, and as I looked at the final blueprints for Apex Solutions, I realized that the only person who had truly stayed with me through the darkness was the woman I saw in the mirror, the woman who didn't need a mansion or a silk robe to be powerful. On Monday morning at 9 a.m., the 14 months of silence would end, and the broken office chair would finally strike back with the force of 1,000 balanced ledgers. Julian had spent company funds on a kitchen remodel, but I had spent my time and my last $5,000 on the one thing he could never defeat, the absolute mathematical certainty of his own destruction. The audit was over. The forensic harvest was complete, and as I closed my laptop in the quiet of my tiny apartment, I knew that the next time I saw Julian, he wouldn't be handing me a divorce settlement. He would be begging for mercy from a woman who no longer remembered how to give it. The grand ballroom of the Arizona Biltmore in downtown Phoenix was a cavernous, gold-leafed monument to the very vanity that had fueled Julian's betrayal, and on this humid evening, it served as the perfectly lit stage for the Logistics Excellence Gala. Inside, 450 of the industry's most powerful figures sat at circular tables draped in heavy ivory linen, preparing to consume $500 a plate Wagyu steaks and sip on vintage Krug champagne, while the scent of overpriced floral arrangements and ego hung thick in the air. Julian was at the center of it all, seated at the head table beneath a massive crystal chandelier that probably cost more than the motel I had inhabited for months, waiting to receive his hand-polished glass Founder of the Year award. He looked bloated and uncomfortably flushed in a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo that struggled to contain the physical manifestations of 14 months of unchecked excess and corporate gluttony. Beside him, Elena was a shimmering testament to my stolen life, dripping in over $20,000 worth of Cartier Panthère jewelry that caught the light with every predatory tilt of her head as she leaned in to whisper into the ear of the lead partner from the private equity firm. They were there to celebrate more than just an award. They were celebrating the finalization of the sale of Miller Logistics for a staggering $12.4 million, a deal they believed was closed, signed, and waiting only for a ceremonial handshake. They thought they had successfully laundered 28 years of my labor into a retirement fund built on lies. But as the clock on the wall struck 8:15 p.m., I pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors and stepped into the air-conditioned opulence of their delusion. I wasn't wearing a faded Target blouse or a suitcase of old sweaters anymore. I was wearing a $2,000 charcoal gray wool and silk power suit from Theory that had been tailored to my exact proportions, fitting my frame like a suit of high-tech armor. My hair, which had been graying at the temples from the stress of my 14-month exile in a 400-square-foot studio, was styled into a sharp, uncompromising bob that reflected the clinical precision of the audit I carried in my designer briefcase. I walked across the plush Axminster carpet with a steady, rhythmic gait that cut through the low murmur of the crowd, my heels clicking with the finality of a judge's gavel. I didn't look for a seat, and I didn't wait for an invitation. I walked straight toward the head table where the light was brightest and the stakes were highest. The room didn't fall silent immediately, but a ripple of confused recognition began to spread from the tables near the door as people realized that the woman they had been told was recovering from a nervous breakdown in a private facility was actually standing in front of them, looking more composed and dangerous than she ever had in 28 years of marriage. Julian saw me when I was exactly 15 feet away, and I watched the color drain from his face in a way that no amount of expensive bronzer could hide, his hand freezing as he reached for a silver fork. He looked at me with a mixture of terror and disbelief, his eyes darting to Elena, who had gone rigid, her hand instinctively flying to the Cartier necklace that I had tracked through the company's fraudulent office supplies ledger. The lead partner of the equity firm, a man named Sterling who prided himself on his due diligence, looked between us with a growing expression of corporate concern as he realized the clean exit he had been promised was about to become a forensic disaster. I didn't give Julian the chance to speak, and I didn't give him the chance to orchestrate a scene. I simply reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single high-gloss folder containing the executive summary of the Apex Solutions technical audit and the IRS whistleblower affidavit. I moved with the calculated silence of the proprietary routing software I had built, placing the folder directly onto the table between Julian's steak and his champagne flute, the weight of the 800 pages of evidence creating a dull thud that seemed to echo through the entire ballroom. Julian's breath hitched in his throat, the sound of a man who realized the engine had finally stopped running for the hood ornament, and I saw his gaze fall on the logo of Apex Solutions, the company he didn't know existed, but which had already legally secured the exclusive operating licenses for his 3 largest distribution hubs. He thought the $12.4 million was his ticket to a life of leisure with Elena in La Jolla, but he was looking at the documentation that proved he had committed 12 counts of perjury regarding his assets, and that the company he was trying to sell was essentially a hollowed-out shell filled with data corruption scripts and frozen offshore accounts. The humidity of the Phoenix evening seemed to penetrate the room in that moment, the air becoming heavy and unbreathable for the man who had tried to discard me like a broken office chair. I leaned down, my face inches from his, smelling the expensive scotch and the cheap desperation rolling off him in waves. I whispered, loud enough for Sterling and the surrounding partners to hear, that the $412,650 he had stolen from our joint account had been traced to the mortgage of Elena's condo, and that the logistics excellence he was being honored for was actually a 14-month masterpiece of my own design. I told him that while he was spending $45,000 on a kitchen remodel, I was living on $3.50 ramen bowls and generic coffee to ensure that when this night finally came, there would be nothing left of his empire but the tuxedo he was currently sweating through. The smirks were gone, replaced by the stark, terrifying reality of a forensic harvest that was now being delivered in full view of his peers. Elena tried to speak, her voice a shrill, frantic attempt to regain control of the narrative, but I didn't even turn my head to acknowledge her existence. She was a footnote in a ledger I had already closed. I looked at Julian, the man who had handed me a 14-page divorce settlement on my birthday, and I felt a profound, cold sense of liberation that had nothing to do with the $12.4 million and everything to do with the truth. The trap wasn't just about the money or the company. It was about the moment of absolute clarity when the world realizes who was truly holding the house of cards together. As the Founder of the Year music began to play in the background, a hollow and ironic soundtrack to his downfall, I stood up straight and adjusted the lapels of my charcoal suit. The gala was just beginning for everyone else, but for Julian Miller the clock had finally run out, and the one-way credit he had tried to give me was now being returned to him with interest that he could never hope to repay. I saw the security guards shifting at the edges of the room, but they didn't move toward me. They moved toward the table as Sterling, the equity partner, stood up and picked up my folder, his face hardening into the mask of a man who was about to cancel a multi-million-dollar check. I walked back toward the double doors, my reflection in the mirrored walls of the Biltmore showing a woman who was 55 years old, wealthy beyond her wildest dreams, and finally, completely, her own person. The humid Phoenix air felt like a benediction as I stepped out of the ballroom and into the night, leaving the Logistics Excellence Gala to witness the spectacular collapse of a man who forgot that the most dangerous person in the room is the one who knows exactly where the money is hidden. Family isn't the people who take your $1,200 silk robe and your life savings. Family is the integrity you find within yourself when everyone else has left the table. I wasn't Sarah Miller, the discarded wife, anymore. I was the CEO of Apex Solutions, and I had just completed the most successful audit of my life. I walked toward the valet stand where a sleek 2025 midnight black Tesla Model S was waiting for me, a car I had purchased with the first legitimate consulting fee from my new firm. I didn't look back at the gold-leafed monument to Julian's vanity, and I didn't wait to hear the fallout of the award ceremony that would never happen. I simply got into the driver's seat, the smell of new leather and high-end technology replacing the scent of jasmine and betrayal, and I drove toward the skyline of a city that was no longer a desert of my exile, but the map of my future. The numbers were balanced, the truth was unpacked, and as the lights of downtown Phoenix faded in my rearview mirror, I realized that the best birthday present I ever received wasn't a cruise or a piece of jewelry. It was the 14 months of darkness that taught me how to find my own light. I didn't scream, and I didn't allow the burning rage in my chest to manifest as anything other than a cold, surgical precision that would have made a diamond cutter look sloppy. As Julian stood behind the mahogany podium with its polished brass emblem, adjusting the microphone to begin his self-congratulatory speech about the tireless dedication required to build an empire like Miller Logistics, I simply stepped onto the side of the stage. My $2,000 charcoal theory suit caught the spotlight, the fine wool shimmering with a subtle, professional sheen that stood in stark contrast to the bloated, sweating mess Julian was becoming in his midnight blue tuxedo. He paused, a confused and slightly panicked smile faltering on his lips as I ignored his outstretched hand and walked past him toward the technical booth at the rear of the stage. The AV technician, a young man who looked startled by my sudden appearance and the sheer authority radiating from my posture, barely hesitated when I handed him a decrypted USB drive, the one I had prepared during those long, lonely nights in my 400-square-foot studio while living on $3.50 ramen bowls. I whispered a single command into the technician's headset, and the giant high-definition LED screens that lined the ballroom, which were supposed to display a glossy montage of Julian's success story and his visionary leadership, suddenly flickered and transitioned into a series of stark, high-contrast digital spreadsheets. The transformation in the room was instantaneous and visceral as the soft, celebratory ambient lighting seemed to sharpen into a harsh, interrogative glare. The screens didn't show pictures of our fleet or the smiling faces of the drivers I had managed for 28 years. Instead, they displayed the undeniable, cold-blooded reality of the wire transfer logs I had painstakingly harvested from the shadow ledgers. There it was, in font large enough for every one of the 450 guests to read. 12 distinct sequential payments of exactly $50,000 each, all routed from the Miller Logistics primary operating account into Elena's personal account at a boutique bank in La Jolla. These transactions were all categorized under the blatant, fraudulent label of operational expenses or fleet maintenance subsidies, a trail of breadcrumbs that led directly from Julian's vanity to the woman currently sitting at the head table, clutching her $20,000 Cartier necklace like a lifeline that had just snapped. I didn't wait for the audience to process the visual data on their own. I stepped to the secondary microphone, my voice clear and steady, devoid of the tremors that had plagued me on the night of my birthday when I was discarded with a $65 Uber credit. I began to read the numbers with the clinical detachment of a lead auditor conducting a terminal review, my words cutting through the humid, suffocating air of the ballroom like a scalpel. I called out, account 4092, routing 0110, and the specific date stamps for each of the 12 transfers, totaling exactly $600,000 that had been systematically stolen from the company's shareholders and the very partners sitting in the front row. The room went into a state of absolute, deafening silence, a vacuum of sound so profound that you could actually hear a single silver Wedgwood fork hit the limestone floor at the back of the hall with a sharp metallic ring that felt like the final note of a funeral march. I watched Julian's face in the peripheral glow of the screens, and the transition was spectacular. His expensive, salon-bought tan seemed to evaporate in a matter of seconds, replaced by a sickly, mottled gray that was the exact color of wet, unrefined concrete. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard that I could see the white of his knuckles from 5 feet away, his mouth hanging open in a silent, useless protest as the life he had built on the back of my silence was dismantled in front of the very people he spent his life trying to impress. The private equity investors from Sterling's firm, men who dealt in the hard currency of reputation and due diligence, didn't wait for an explanation or a rebuttal from the man they had intended to hand a $12.4 million check to. As the evidence of corporate embezzlement and fiduciary breach scrolled across the screens behind me, backed by the technical metadata I had secured as the original architect of the routing software, Sterling stood up with a slow, deliberate finality. He didn't look at Julian, and he certainly didn't look at Elena, who was now trembling with a visible, pathetic terror. He simply closed his leather-bound portfolio, signaled to his team of 4 junior partners, and walked out of the ballroom without uttering a single word. The sound of their footsteps on the plush Axminster carpet was the sound of Julian's $12.4 million disappearing into the Arizona night, leaving him standing there in a tuxedo that was now just an expensive costume for a man who had lost everything. I stood my ground on that stage, looking out at the faces of the people who had believed the lie that Julian was the genius and I was just the invisible clerk. I saw the realization dawning on them that the woman who was discarded like a broken office chair was the only reason any of them had ever seen a return on their investment. The contrast between the Founder of the Year award sitting on the table and the $600,000 of stolen funds on the screen was a chasm of pure, unadulterated injustice that had finally been bridged by the data I had spent 14 months protecting. Julian tried to step toward the microphone, his movements jerky and uncoordinated like a marionette with cut strings, but the technical booth, following my pre-programmed override, cut his audio entirely, leaving him shouting into a void of his own making. He was no longer the face of Miller Logistics. He was a liability, a technical error that was being purged from the system in real time, and I was the one performing the deletion. The technical specifications of the betrayal were now public record. as I had ensured that the kill switch on the proprietary software I developed was synchronized with the presentation on the screens. As the investors walked out, the tablet computers at each table, which were supposed to show the company's annual report, began to display the same system lockout screen that I had designed in my studio apartment while eating my $3.50 ramen. The entire infrastructure of Miller Logistics was freezing in place, the trucks grounded, the accounts flagged, and the new wife's access codes rendered utterly useless. Julian looked at the screens, then at me, and I saw the moment the last spark of his arrogance died out, replaced by the hollow, crushing weight of the $14.12 he had left me with on the night of my exile. I had spent 28 years as the engine of his life, and in less than 5 minutes, I had shown the world what happens when the engine is removed and the hood ornament is left to face the wind alone. Elena stood up, her $20,000 Cartier jewelry catching the light one last time before she turned and fled toward the side exit, her heels clicking frantically as she realized that the man she had traded her soul for was now a bankrupt ghost in a custom suit. Julian didn't follow her. He couldn't move, anchored to the podium by the sheer gravity of the 80-page forensic audit that was now being emailed to every major shareholder and the regional office of the IRS. The silence in the ballroom had shifted from shock to a low, buzzing murmur of redirected allegiances as people who had ignored me for 3 decades suddenly found themselves unable to look away from the power I had reclaimed. I had lived in a 5,200-square-foot mansion and felt smaller than a shadow. But on that stage, under the flickering glow of the wire transfer logs, I felt like the architect of a new world, one where the numbers finally told the truth. As I prepared to step down from the stage, I took one last look at the Founder of the Year award, a piece of glass that represented a lie Julian had been telling himself since 1996. I realized that family isn't blood, and it certainly isn't the person who uses operational expenses to fund a secret life with your best friend. Family is the integrity you maintain when you are down to your last $14. I walked back toward the mahogany doors, my $2,000 charcoal suit a testament to the 14 months of discipline and data that had brought me to this moment of absolute mathematical triumph. The gala was effectively over, the stakes were getting cold, and the $12.4 million deal was a smoldering ruin on the floor of the Arizona Biltmore. I was Sarah Miller, I was 55 years old, and I had just proven that in a world of shiny hood ornaments, it is always the engine that decides when the journey is over. The audit was complete, the truth was unpacked, and as I walked out into the cool desert night, I knew that the only thing Julian Miller had left was the sickly gray of his own reflection in the mirrors he had used to hide from himself. Today, the architectural grandeur of the Arizona Biltmore and the suffocating humidity of that Phoenix gala feel like scenes from a film I watched a lifetime ago, rather than the reality I survived, as I sit in the serene, climate-controlled silence of my new life. Julian is currently trading his bespoke Italian suits for a state-issued denim uniform, facing a 5-year prison sentence in a federal facility for the systematic tax evasion and corporate embezzlement I meticulously documented on that yellow legal pad. The man who once obsessed over the polish on his $110,000 Mercedes-Benz now spends his days in a space smaller than the walk-in closet he used to house his $800 shoes, stripped of the titles, the accolades, and the hollow prestige he stole from my decades of silent labor. The judicial system, fueled by the 300-page whistleblower affidavit I handed to Marcus Thorne, moved with a devastating mathematical speed that Julian never saw coming because he was too busy looking at his own reflection. He is no longer the Founder of the Year. He is inmate 4092, a man whose legacy is now defined by the specific fraudulent routing numbers I displayed on those giant LED screens for the entire world to see. The betrayal that began with a 14-page divorce settlement and a $65 Uber credit has reached its final, unchangeable calculation, leaving the perpetrators in the very ruins they tried to build for me. Elena, The woman who once sipped my $85 Cabernet while wearing my $1,200 silk robe vanished the literal second the federal freezing order hit Julian's accounts, and the Cartier jewelry she prized was seized as part of the asset forfeiture. She is no longer dripping in diamonds or lounging in a $5 million mansion. She is currently residing in a drafty 400-square-foot studio apartment on the edges of the city, a place that likely smells of the same industrial cleaner I encountered during my first night of exile. She spends her days working behind the counter at a local dry cleaner, pressing the expensive garments of women who live the life she tried to steal, her hands no longer clutching crystal wine glasses, but instead sorting through the laundry of strangers for a minimum wage that wouldn't cover the tax on a single pair of the shoes she once wore. The smirks and the predatory elegance have been replaced by the weary, gray reality of a woman who realized too late that a man who will betray his wife for you will eventually have nothing left to offer you but his own downfall. In stark contrast to the wreckage of their vanity, I am the sole owner and CEO of Apex Solutions, the logistics powerhouse I built from the ground up while living on $3.50 ramen bowls and generic coffee in a Rogers Park studio. We recently underwent a formal Series A valuation that placed the company at a staggering $25 million, a figure based not on fraudulent shadow ledgers or inflated vanity, but on the proprietary routing software that I spent 14 months perfecting. My firm doesn't rely on the bloated overhead of a 5,200-square-foot mansion or the marketing fees Julian used to fund his secret life in La Jolla. Instead, we operate with a lean, surgical efficiency that has disrupted the very industry Julian thought he owned. Because I cut out the cancer of his incompetence and the parasite of his greed, Apex Solutions currently maintains a 98% profit margin, a number so beautiful and pure that it brings more peace to my soul than any luxury car ever could. I am no longer the invisible engine working at 2:45 a.m. to fix a man's mistakes. I am the architect of a digital empire that provides for 64 families, including the drivers who stayed loyal to me when they realized who was actually signing their paychecks. My personal life has mirrored the streamlined efficiency of my business, as I have traded the excessive, hollow opulence of the Lake Forest estate for a quiet 2,000-square-foot penthouse in a building that values privacy over performance. My home features floor-to-ceiling windows that offer an unobstructed, breathtaking view of the mountains, a vista that changes from deep purple to burnished gold every evening without the need for a $12,000 landscaping crew to maintain it. There are no diptyque candles lit to hide the scent of a dying marriage, and no Wedgwood china set for a dinner of lies. There is only the clean, minimalist aesthetic of a woman who has finally learned the value of her own space. I live in a world of absolute silence and profound peace, where the only ticking I hear is the steady, reliable rhythm of a life that is finally balanced. The $14.12 I once held in my pocket has grown into a fortune, but the real wealth lies in the fact that I no longer have to justify my existence or my intelligence to a man who viewed me as a depreciated asset. The transition from the discarded wife to the $25 million CEO was not a journey of revenge, though the justice felt sweet. It was a journey of forensic reclamation, a stripping away of every toxic element that had been clogging my internal gears for 28 years. I remember the exact weight of that Samsonite suitcase filled with old sweaters, and I keep it in the back of my new walk-in closet as a reminder of the night my life split in two. It serves as a monument to the moment I realized that tears don't pay bills, but data does, and that the most dangerous person in the world is a woman who has been given a one-way ticket to nowhere and chooses to build her own destination. Julian and Elena are footnotes in a case study on corporate hubris, while I am the living proof that a broken office chair can indeed lead a revolution if she knows how to read the fine print. The audit of my life is finally complete, and the results show a massive surplus of dignity, independence, and cold, hard success. I spend my mornings now not reconciling Julian's tax errors, but sitting on my terrace with a cup of high-end espresso, the kind that Marcus Thorne first introduced me to, watching the sun rise over the peaks. I am 56 years old, and for the first time since I was a young woman with a dream of computer science and a belief in family, I am not looking for approval in the eyes of a man who cannot see my worth. My name is Sarah Miller, and I have proven that the engine doesn't need the hood ornament to reach the finish line. It only needs the courage to stop carrying the weight of someone else's vanity. The house on Briarwood Lane and the mansion in Scottsdale have been sold to pay off Julian's mounting legal debts and the back taxes he owes the state, and I am the one who quietly purchased the proprietary rights to the Miller name just so I could retire it forever. There is no more Miller logistics, and there is no more Miller marriage. There is only Apex, and there is only me. The peace I feel in this penthouse is a physical sensation, a lightness in my chest that comes from knowing that every cent I own was earned with integrity, and every mountain view I see is mine to keep. I no longer drive a 2014 Honda with a rattle in the dashboard, but I also don't need a $100,000 Mercedes to prove I have arrived. My success is written in the balanced ledgers of my company and the quiet authority of my presence. The betrayal of August 14th was the most painful experience of my life, but it was also the most necessary, acting as the catalyst that forced me to stop being a ghost in my own home and start being the hero of my own story. I have learned that family isn't the people who share your DNA or the name on your marriage license. Family is the people who don't drain your bank account while you're sleeping, and the people who show up for the audit when the truth finally comes out. As I close my laptop for the day, the 98% profit margin glowing on the screen like a beacon of my new reality, I realize that the one-way Uber credit Julian gave me was the greatest gift he ever could have offered. It was the ticket out of a prison I didn't even know I was in, a push into the cold desert night that forced me to find the fire within myself. Today, I am not a victim, I am not a discard, and I am certainly not a broken chair. I am the woman who balanced the books and found that the most important number in the world was the one representing my own freedom. The audit is finished, the debts are paid, and the view from the top is even better than I imagined it would be when I was sitting in room 214 of the Sunset Vista Motel. I am Sarah Miller. I am 56 years old, and I have finally, officially, achieved a state of perfect, profitable peace.